Hey everyone, welcome to the Podcast Expansion Network, your go-to destination for insider tips and success stories in podcast growth. I'm your host, Victor Dwyer, and today we're joined by our very special guest, Mike Konrad. Mike is the producer and host of the popular Reliability Matters podcast, a show that you can find on almost every major platform. Today, we're talking about conscious marketing through podcast. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. Please give the audience an intro of who you are and how you got into all this.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Victor. In terms of all this, I'll expand that answer a little bit. I started in the electronic assembly world, selling equipment for parts of the electronic assembly industry. Way back in 1985 when I was 24 years old. And about 7 years later, I left the company and started my own business. And as the founder, entrepreneur, head honcho, chief cook and bottle washer, all of that, back in the day, I did everything, including marketing. And the way we marketed way back in those days, this is pre-internet, if you can imagine, right? Pre-internet.
Wow.
We would run ads in magazines and attend trade shows, and it was very Mad Men, right? It was like Mad Men. It was run the most eye-catching, obnoxious, braggadocious ad you possibly can and get attention. And hopefully your phones will ring. That's the way it worked back then. And we would exhibit at trade shows and have these outlandish displays that had nothing to do with what we were selling. It was just to get attention, cheap tricks. We had waterfalls and video games and all sorts of things, yeah. Next to us, back in those days, there were models in the booth, like a car show today. There were models in a booth just to get attention. And although we never went that route. That worked for a lot of years until it stopped working. So that's what got me into the podcasting space. That's what got me into content creation and all of that I'm deep into now. And it was just an alternate marketing strategy. And it's proven over the last several years to be one that is highly effective.
Yeah. With all that in mind, I want to go into a little bit about your podcast structure. How do you structure your podcast, and why did you structure it in that particular way?
Yeah, my podcast, which is, I'll warn people, I'll say the name, it's called Reliability Matters. But I'll warn you, if you're not in the electronics world, you might find it as effective as Ambien at putting you to sleep, and it's certainly not addictive. I started the podcast to create this knowledge vault of information provided by subject matter experts. In the electronics world, there's all these rabbit holes, all these silos of technology. And if you're an expert in one silo, you may know very little about another silo. So all these silos have experts within them. I wanted to mind meld them, Spock, Star Trek, mind meld them, and put on record some of their greatest advice and thoughts and things like that. So I thought, well, what the heck? I listened to podcasts. This is several years ago. I listened to podcasts. So therefore, I must be an expert on podcasts because I listened to them, right? So I listened to Joe Rogan. Now all of a sudden I'm an expert. And so, it's like going to a restaurant and thinking you could be a cook, right? It's like the two different things. But I thought, let's try it. I'll commit to doing 10 episodes just as a goof, let's how bad could it be? And I committed to doing 10 episodes about 150 episodes ago. I just kept sticking with it. Uh-huh. And the format of the show is exactly what all the advice I got from fellow podcasters who were in the space before me warned me against the format I have now. And they said, I said, how long should the podcast be? Like, each episode should be 20 to 30 minutes, max, no longer than 30 minutes. I'm like, okay, I'll commit to that. And the first episode was an hour because I couldn't stop it. It was still interesting. It was still going, right? So then the second episode, I said, I'll fix it on the second episode. And the second episode was like an hour and 5 minutes. And the third episode was probably an hour and 2 minutes. And I can't stop making them an hour long. They just organically last about an hour. So then I gave myself some advice. I said, look, a podcast should be as long as it is interesting and valuable to the audience. If it's 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. If it's a short or a reel, great. If it's an hour-long, long-format podcast, okay. And that's where we ended up. So I put the podcast out on two different formats, two different mediums. One is the traditional audio podcast that you get on Apple and Google and Spotify and iHeart and Amazon and all the usual suspects. And that's audio only. And that's where the overwhelming majority of my audience listens to the podcast. And I also produce a video version of it. I record it once, like you're doing, and record it on video, and then I strip off the audio and post that to the podcast sites. But the advantage of the video format is that if my guest needs to explain something, or if they have some graphic collaterals, to go along with it, I can show that on the screen, which you can't see when you're driving your car with your earbuds in. So the YouTube version has a much, much smaller audience because the optics of sitting in your cubicle at work watching YouTube for an hour as your boss walks by, that just doesn't look too cool. But my audience, a small portion of them, really like the video version. And I like recording on video because I get to make this connection, right? I can see the terror or the excitement in my guest's eyes as I bring up a certain question.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, like, oh, don't ask me that. Yeah. So that's the format of the show. It's Q&A, me the Q, them the A. And probably the most challenging part used to be the production of it, as I'm sure you went through. You had to teach yourself or be taught how to do it. And the technology changes over the years. And so that was one thing. But the most challenging, consistently challenging part of a podcast is I have to interview experts in subjects that I am not an expert in. So I need to educate myself at least enough to know what questions to ask, right? So, you don't want to ask a painter, someone who's an expert in painting, you don't want to ask them, what temperature should the steak be before you flip it over? That may not be in their toolbox. So I have to educate myself. I do that by reading papers that they may have published or looking at video content they may have published. I use AI quite a bit to generate questions on a very specific subject, and that's never failed me. Most of my time is in prep. The actual hour broadcast is small in comparison to the amount of prep that I have to do. Which I answered a question you didn't ask, by the way. I tend to do that.
And I think that's a really good point, too. You said basically like getting context on the subject so that way you can ask better questions. And I think as a podcaster, that's so crucial. And it's very, very important to have context on the subject and have context about your guest. So that way you can ask really, really good questions. So rather than it being general questions, interview questions, you can ask very, very specific ones to get more granular and to get more actionable advice off of it by knowing your interviewer and also, or interviewee, I guess I should say, and the actual subject itself. So that way you can get really drilled down to those questions. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. And the other thing that I have to know is who's my audience. So clearly, if someone's talking about a very specific part of our industry, I don't want them to speak in their lingo. I don't want them to, start drilling really deep and going down their rabbit hole, because the purpose of the show is to educate people within our space on areas they're not too familiar with. So I constantly have to remind my guests to make it, quote unquote, kindergarten clear. And I don't mean to speak down to anyone, but to be mindful that the audience that we want to educate is here because they don't already know. If they already knew, they wouldn't get any value out of the show. So we have to keep it simple enough. Also mindful of the fact that the majority of my audience are scientists and engineers and PhDs and so we can't insult them by making it too simple, but we also can't assume they know what we're talking about. So I play that role quite well because I organically don't know everything they're talking about. So I ask questions as if, like my audience would be thinking, because my view is if I'm thinking it and I don't know the answer to the question, they're probably in the same boat. So I tell my guests, it's like taking a stone and skimming it over the water, right? You just want it to not go deep. You want it to bounce along the surface before it sinks. Because they can always, once they get a little bit of taste of that, there's other resources where they can go deep if they want to. But we don't really want to mine for gold. We want to find the gold dust on the surface, not too deep.
Yeah, I totally agree. So now that we understand your format of how you do your podcast and the structure behind it a little bit, what is your marketing strategy behind the podcast? How do you actually market your podcast to grow it or possibly be a little bit more successful?
Well, I have this nasty habit, Victor, of inventing things. Maybe you've done it. You invent something in your head and then you find out it's already been invented, right? Or in my case, I do that all the time. And, I'll see something on the market and go, I thought of that. Of course, I didn't do anything about it. I also invent words and phrases that turn out to already be in existence, even though
Wow.
it was original thought for me, but someone else already thought of it. So if I say some terms which I think I invented, and you or your audience has already heard of them, there's my disclaimer. The way we used to market was very, as I said earlier, very braggadocious. We would run ads about our equipment, boasting certain specs. Like if we were a car company, we would talk about horsepower and torque. In this case, our version of that is horsepower, but electric motor horsepower, and CFM and wattage and pressure and all the stuff that's part of our world. And
Yeah.
that would just land with a thud, because what we didn't realize is most people who need our machine don't know they need our machine. They're having reliability issues with circuit boards, with circuit assemblies, and the products that those assemblies are in. They're failing in the field, and they don't know why. So for us to talk about a product that they have no connection to as a solution is pointless, right? But that's what we did.
Yeah.
And then one year, several years ago, we were exhibiting at a trade show. It was the last show we exhibited at in a long time, because we totally changed our minds for this reason. We had this gnarly waterfall. It was 30 feet wide, 15 feet high. But instead of dropping water in a sheet, there was thousands of little nozzles like an inkjet printer would have. And it dropped these little droplets of water in a sequence so that words and images fell from the sky made of water, right? It was super cool. And we spent a lot of money renting that. I think it cost us $70,000 to rent it for the 3-day show.
Wow.
Yeah, wow, yeah. And the morning of the show, someone came up to me and they went, "Mike, that's the coolest looking booth I've ever seen." And I just like, yeah, good job, Mike. Yeah, my 70,000. I got one fan. And he noticed our equipment was on wheels, and he says, well, first he said, "Is there any way you could take a picture? I could take a picture of your booth, because you're not supposed to take pictures." I'm like, "Absolutely, you can." And then he says, "Is there any way you can move your equipment out of the way so that I can get a better picture of the booth?" And that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks, Victor. It's just like, what the hell are we doing? Why are we don't sell waterfalls. We sell other types of machines. What are we doing? This has just gone crazy. That was the light bulb moment. And we realized that our advertising was not really effective. We were selling equipment, but it really had nothing to do. It was in spite of the fact that we were running ads. And the way we were exhibiting at shows was all carnival tricks. It was just a parlor trick. So
I want to see you get on a like one of those balls and start juggling. I could see it. I could see it.
I could see it. If I would wear a clown nose or a dress or whatever it took, back in those days, whatever it took to sell machines, I would do it. I had very little honor back then. But so we figured, okay, it's time for something new. What do we need to do? And I created this term, which turns out I didn't create it at all. It was already out there. But in my head, I created it, called conscious marketing. And so we need to market in a different way. We need to be conscious of how we're marketing. We need to connect to the customer on a whole different level. So overnight, we stopped going to shows. We were doing 10 shows a year, and we stopped going to trade shows. Overnight, we stopped advertising in magazines. We advertised print ads all over the place, and then digital ads and banners and things like that. We sent out obnoxious email blasts. We were spammers, we just spammed everybody, about our products, obviously. And we stopped all of that, just cold turkey. And we decided, okay, what are we going to do with our extra energy and our extra bandwidth and money? So we're going to switch our marketing model to education. And we're not going to talk about our products. We're going to talk about the problems that our industry is having and best practice solutions for those problems, which we believe are our products, but we didn't draw that line. We let the customer draw that line. And one thing I learned a long time ago, but I never really put into practice, was another thing I coined, another phrase I coined, which I think has already been coined, called guided discovery. And that means, Victor, I need you to buy my machine. But if I tell you how great my machine is, that's not going to be all that effective. You need to come to the conclusion on your own, through your own research, through the analysis of facts and data, that my machine is the solution to your problem. Once Victor decides, oh yeah, that's the solution to my problem, then you'll fall on your sword to get that into your company, right? I don't have to convince you. You convinced you. So we needed then to give our potential customers, give the industry all the facts and data. Fortunately, all of our customers are engineers and scientists, so they're smart. They can draw the dots between a solution and a problem. And we just needed to give them the facts and the data. And then I found out through experience, the best way to sell your product is don't talk about your product, which is so counterintuitive, but rather concentrate on the customer issues at hand. Let them know you understand. And at the end of all that, I didn't set out to be a quote unquote influencer. I don't like that term because when I hear influencer, I think of the Kardashians or, never something like super enviable. But truly, we became influencers because we were influential at providing facts and data that were helpful to the industry. And then we just decided to make it our mantra, a policy, that no matter what we did, if we were in front of a lectern, I do a lot of public speaking around the world, if I'm in front of a lectern, if I'm in front of a camera, if I'm writing a technical paper, producing a webinar, on a podcast, whatever, the number one goal is to provide value. We need to provide value. Everything we do, all the mediums that we do it in, we have to provide value. Because if we're not providing value, we're just talking heads. Maybe we're entertainment, but entertainment is value. So we just ask ourselves, is what we're going to do valuable to our industry? If the answer is no, we don't do it. If the answer is yes, we do it. And which is why I do shows like yours. And I don't do this to sell equipment. I don't think your customers are going to buy from me, and that's fine. I do it because everything we do needs to provide value. Whether that value comes back to me or my company or some other person or company, that's fine. It all goes somewhere. And I believe wholeheartedly that you put good stuff out there, good stuff comes back. And I don't mean to sound metaphysical or religious or anything like that, or new agey, but that philosophy has proven itself to be accurate over and over and over and over again, whether I listen to that or not.
Yeah, I totally believe that. I totally believe in good and bad karma.
Absolutely.
I do a lot of things just saying, hey, they go, Victor, we got to pay you at some point. I'm like, hey, don't worry about it. Like good karma, somehow it'll come back to me.
Right. So I do a lot of content creation, and I still own my company, but I'm semi-retired. Well, I'm completely retired from operations. They basically pay me to stay away, which is a great investment from their part. Because entrepreneurs and company founders.
Go away.
No, yeah. Well, one thing I didn't realize until many years later is company founders, entrepreneurs are great visionaries. We're just creative all the time, but we drive everyone around us completely nuts, right? We just drive everyone crazy because we're like a serial arsonist, only instead of fires, we're starting projects. But we're not real interested in finishing the projects. We just leave a trail of partially started, mostly completed, but still incomplete projects at our heels. And other people have to come and finish it up. But we're always interested in that shiny object in the corner. So as soon as we're into the tedious part of wrapping up a design, all of a sudden something over here becomes exciting and we chase that new idea. So we drive people crazy. So I still own the company. I still own 100% of the shares, but my team runs the company way better than I ever did. And I get to do what I absolutely love to do, which is create content, talk to people like you, share my experience. I won't call it wisdom because I don't know if it's wise, but I'll share my experience and other people can decide whether that is wise or not.
Yeah. When I got my operation manager, it took me 6 months to cycle through enough operation managers to find the right one. And after I got the right one, the one I got after 2 weeks of work, they did more in the 6 months of any operation manager I had. So it was amazing. And so, yes, that makes it really, really amazing. It makes it really, really nice. And I want to go back to your conscious marketing. So what is your exact definition of conscious marketing, I guess?
I don't know if I have a super refined definition. I can tell you more what it's not. It's not what we used to do. To me, it is connecting to the potential customer on a more conscious level, meaning to kind of get into their head, understand their issues, getting them to realize we do understand their issues, getting them to realize that it's more important for us to help them solve their issue than it is to get a sale. I mean, now I say that a little bit insincerely because obviously we do this as an alternative to traditional marketing. So clearly, we're in business to make money. We're in business to be profitable because we have to service all the customers we've had for the last 32 years. So our motivation is to stay in business. But I'm very conscious of the fact that the customers that are meant to be our customers will be our customers. And not everyone should be our customer. We should not be the vendor for everybody. Maybe the fit's not right. And in the early days, we used to force that fit. Now it's just like, no, if it comes, it comes. If we put the goal on education and helping a customer, a company solve its problem, then that's our goal. If we get a machine out of it, sale out of it, or service out of it, or whatever the case may be, even better. But if we concentrate only on sales, like we used to do, it would be like putting a net out into the ocean, trolling,
Yeah.
and expecting to eat everything you catch in that net. Some of the things you catch in that net are not edible, or bad tasting, or poisonous. We want to put a hook in the water in terms of socially conscious marketing, of value, of education. And people who are interested in that content will, be attracted to that lure. And I shouldn't say lure because that sounds false, but you know what I mean. So not every customer should be our customer. And I didn't understand this for a lot of years. We choose our customers as much as our customers choose us. And I never thought that. I thought anyone that comes with a purchase order and a hope and pain, maybe even on time, they're our customer. Anyone with a pulse, just like in the early days, anyone with a pulse and a willingness to work for what we offered would be an employee back then. Obviously all that changed, thankfully. So once we stopped pursuing the sale and started pursuing the education, the customers that came to us were dream customers. We didn't have those toxic customers that negotiate down any profit margin you have and then cost you money during the whole, life of the machine because they're needy and, they don't maintain their equipment. They're always looking for bargains, all of that. We got a much higher level customer, and we were better able to serve them. They are more our partners than they are just our customers, not customer supplier. It's really a partnership that we're able to establish through conscious marketing. Conscious marketing brings more conscious customers to us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And so going to growth on like how to like effectively grow a podcast, what tips would you give someone to actually grow their podcast?
Oh my gosh, patience, patience. I've heard so many podcasters say this, and at first I'm just like, I don't like that advice, but I think it's true. It is not an overnight, for mere mortals, it's not an overnight sensation. The people that you see on TikTok that go viral with several million followers, or YouTubers with several million followers, those are the people who want a lottery ticket. People do win lottery tickets, but the chance of winning a lottery ticket is very small. People do get auditions to be in movies and get discovered. The chance of that for everyone else is very, very small. For everyone else, it's consistency. When I recorded my first podcast, back then it was audio only, so I'm just staring at a microphone, talking to absolutely nobody. Because A, it was recorded, so there was no one on the other end. But when it went out, like a week later, it went out to 0 people, right? Because no one had heard of the podcast. The second episode, I talked to, I could see how many subscribers I had or how many downloads I had. And I had, 3. So now I know, okay, I'm probably talking to 3 people, right? And then the next one, we do it every 2 weeks, do it twice a month. The next one, maybe I had 10 people download the prior episodes. So it's something, if you watch it every day, you'll get frustrated and stop doing it. Just have to do it and keep doing it and keep the consistency and the cadence. If you're doing it every week, do it every week. If you're doing it every 2 weeks like I do it every 2 weeks. But don't miss one. Keep it going. And don't worry about perfection. You're going to make mistakes. Totally going to make mistakes. Learn from it. In fact, I used to clean up everything. I would take hours to edit because I just wanted it to be perfect. And I still tend to myself, all that. I tend to take at least some of that stuff out. But I do leave some mistakes in consciously because I'm human and I don't want to be, the NBC news anchor, that's just perfect, monotone, voice of God. I want to be the human that's talking to my guests. So over time, when you look, you'll go, oh my God, it seemed like a few days ago, it was a couple years ago, my wife and I actually toasted with champagne that we had 1,000 downloads. My podcast had been downloaded 1,000 times. And keep in mind, I'm in a pretty niche industry. It's not like, it's not going to go viral on TikTok or anything. And, right now we're a little over 80,000 downloaded episodes. So I don't know who's doing it because I don't think there's 80,000 people in our industry, but I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for it. And we have more and more episodes, so obviously that number's going to grow. But it's just a question of sticking with it, keep making it better, You're going to make mistakes. Make your second one better than your first one. Make your third one better than your second one, and just keep going. And then you'll find it's almost an addiction. I keep about a 2 month to 3 month backlog of podcasts. Like right now, if I recorded you on my show today, it wouldn't air until July because I've got two a month all ready to go, all edited, all scheduled out. I get nervous when I start running low. It's like then I feel like, oh, I got to interview anyone. But if you're a guest-oriented podcast, always look for interesting guests. I carry business cards around that have the name of my podcast on it. And I'm fortunate that I speak at a lot of conferences around the world. So I'm around people within my industry a lot. And when I hear them speak, if I'm like, oh, that was good, I'll nail them right there. I'll corner them and I'll book them as a guest. And so, it's just always look for new content and be authentic and go from there. Now, my model's a little bit unique in that I don't have sponsors. I don't want sponsors. I don't run commercials. I don't want commercials. If I was doing this just as my sole occupation, then I would have to look for sponsors and run commercials or somehow monetize the podcast. I'm doing the podcast for another reason. I'm doing the podcast because that's part of our education model for my company. So even though we don't talk about anything to do with what my company does, we talk about everything else pretty much. It still provides credibility. It still provides this level of influence in my industry for me. So I do it for that reason. So, if you're going to grow and all you're doing is a podcast and you don't have a day job, then part of your growth is going to have to be looking for sponsors and ways to monetize your podcast. So you got to look for guests regularly. You got to do all that. And because I'm an interview show, I encourage my audience to post their episode on their social media and on their website. And many of them do. And that helps grow the show. I've got 2 companies in our industry that are publishing companies, and they syndicate my show. And that helps grow the show. So, it's just a question of consistency and getting the word out. There's a million podcasts out there. So I think that's quite a literal number, give or take. So maybe 10 million podcasts, whatever there are. There's a lot of competition. People have to look for what you're talking about, unless you're a big celebrity, which, of course, I'm not.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, thank you, Mike, so much for joining. Please tell the audience how to find you, how to find more about your podcast and everything else like that.
Sure. Well, if you happen to be in the electronic space or you're just curious, you can find the podcast on all your favorite podcast app and on our YouTube channel. The podcast is called Reliability Matters. If you just Google Reliability Matters podcast, you'll find it. It's also at reliabilitymatterspodcast.com. And then if you want just more information on me, MikeKonrad.com. That's Konrad with a K. So MikeKonrad.com takes you to my personal site. And from there, it just tells you what I do. I do a lot of public speaking, and it tells you I speak mostly on technical matters, but I also enjoy speaking on entrepreneurship and conscious marketing and things like that.
Cool. Well, awesome. Mike, thank you so much for joining. Thank you for your time today. And thank you, audience, as well, for listening if you got this far. And this is the Podcast Expansion Network, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Victor.